All right, welcome everybody. I know many faces that are here, but just a little bit of introduction. My name is Father Tucker Redding. I'm the new chaplain director of the Rice Catholic Student Center, and I'm excited to be able to be kind of the first speaker of this Out Your Speaker series for this semester. I'm also excited, if not a bit intimidated, honestly, by our topic for tonight, because it is vast, but it's also, I think, very beautiful. This is kind of how I ended up titling in that, and I'll go through that in a little bit, a good God and a bad world. But to be honest, what I think this talk and so many of the talks that we're going to have this semester really go into are these major questions that we have. And to be honest, no matter if we are believers or not, I think questions that we grapple with, that we might grapple with in the case of believing or wanting to believe, and even people who are just very devout might still have some of these questions that linger within. And so our hope this semester with our talks in the speaker series is to be able to really dive deeper into some of these topics. So today, the way that I am breaking down some of this topic is, this really is expansive, but I think there's a beauty to that. So one thing about, especially if we're looking at a bad world, is thinking a little bit about when we see suffering, experience suffering in the world. Our experience of just what's going on in our own lives, what's going on around us. And to be honest, too, this talk was decided before these events, but honestly, even just how we began the semester. To begin the year already sort of grappling with just really awful and terrifying events that really shake us to our core. And sometimes we feel those in a very particular way, like we did this semester. And sometimes we just know about it sort of in an intellectual way, that there is suffering, there is evil, there's a lot going on in our world. So already there's a lot to grapple with that. But along with that is grappling with the nature of God, the will of God, and then our own will, and how all of those sort of come together. So these are some of the topics that we'll be grappling with over the next 45 minutes, which is totally enough time to get into the entire depth of that. And I'm joking about that a little bit, only because one of the things I kind of want to preface with tonight is that we are sort of starting a conversation together. We are journeying into some of these topics, knowing that these are very expansive. And that it's something that we will continue grappling with tonight. I will promise to navigate us through some of that area, but the fact is, we are still, these are things that we're still going to be grappling with and continuing to walk away with questions and further discussions. But there's a beauty to that because we do that as a community together. Now, I've already brought up like a few different topics, which this word, and maybe this just comes from my own love of like superhero movies and stuff like that, where like multiverse is all the rage. But I keep thinking about the word multiverse. All of these topics present like a multiverse of questions that we could travel down extensively. Questions upon questions upon questions. So tonight, I've sort of decided a route that we're going to take. In a few cases, I'm going to just make assumptions that we're going to travel with. For the most part, I'm going to try to be honest about some of those assumptions that we're going with and the reason why we're going to go with them. But in some cases, we're going to just travel down sort of a route through some of the questions that we have here tonight. I do have a background in studying philosophy and communication and theology, but I do want to also express, well, kind of in my own humility, that there's only so much of this area that I might be able to navigate myself, including to answer extensive questions about. If you do have particular questions, I would be happy to try to field those or at least go into further discussion. And at the same time as well, I'd like us to end this evening with going into a bit of a discussion of maybe some of the points that hit or resonated the most with you, questions that you still have, areas that we can continue a conversation together. So first, here are a few of the concepts that I would like to lay out for this talk. One is going to be talking about the nature of God. Once again, already a massive subject in and of itself. And in particular, already I've made a big assumption here. That some people will question, that some people in the world do question. But throughout, especially the major monotheistic religions in the world, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. The base assumption of all of these faiths is that God is all good, all-knowing, and all-loving. And so that is kind of where we're starting in this idea of the nature of God. Now again, I'm already throwing out there assumptions that have vast conversations behind them as well. Those I am not diving into tonight, but there are extensive places that you can look to go much further into those areas. We're also going to be talking about the area of free will, which is kind of getting into the nature of humanity. A big question along with that, I almost hate asking this because I'm not going to go much further with it. Do we even have free will? Tonight I'm assuming yes. I'm going to go ahead and assume that we do in fact have free will. And I say that a bit jokingly, but that again is like there's a huge philosophical question we could have around the actuality of us having free will. That is an assumption I am also going to make tonight. And the other itself is sort of the nature of an existence of evil. Even using that particular word, I will dive further into that later, but I do kind of purposely use that word right now too, the existence of evil. And in some ways we could talk about that, our recognition of the fact there is pain and suffering and sin. Again, I'll go a little further in what we mean by evil, but those are some of the concepts that we're going to be diving into further this evening. So the very first thing that I do want to talk about is actually what we call the problem of evil. How many people are already kind of aware of this concept of the problem of evil? Okay. And it's something, too, that even if you haven't heard that title before, I think you'd probably be very aware of this idea. And this, along with many of the ideas here before that we go over tonight, I'm going to hit somewhat of a surface level with some of these just to note. So some of you might know more extensively of these. We're going to be hitting some of the main points. But here's part of the idea. Now, I already mentioned assumptions that we make about God. Since this is here, I'm going to attempt using this. We'll see how far we get with that. And I think especially what we end up with at the end might be interesting. So, the assumptions that we make about God. That God is all-knowing, omniscient, that God is all-powerful, omnipotent, and that God is all good, omnibenevolent. And so these are assumptions that, again, these really come from the three major monotheistic religions in the world. So we begin with this. But then there's another kind of premise that we add onto this. So we have this, and then we add on to it. Evil exists. And there are many different ways of putting that claim. But the idea is if we were starting to go through a logical argument, there are some that would say that a God that fits these qualities does not logically work in a world that evil exists. And the thing is, we know, and we could follow this a little more precisely. There's a lot going on here. But we know on some level this is true. And if we know that's true, then it would seem that maybe there are some problems with these premises. And here are some of the reasons behind that. So, really kind of going very quick over it, but if a God is all good, the assumption would be that God would desire no evil to exist. Again, that's already an assumption, but that would be the idea behind that. If a God is all-powerful, that same God who would not want evil to exist would have the power to eradicate all evil or prevent it in the first place. Now, the one other thing that might be lacking is, well, perhaps there's evil that God doesn't know about, or God doesn't know that we're going to commit certain acts of evil or something like that. And so that kind of hits at all of these different areas, that if evil exists, it would seem that either God is not one or all of these things, and then in some cases, too, people would say that that's actually a proof that God doesn't exist at all, or at least enough evidence to put doubt in the existence of God. So that is, it's kind of a quick and dirty version of that argument. So there are a few ways in which we would go a little further with this. And just to let you know, too, especially because this could be an extra resource if you would really like to go further into the topic, I am using the layout of a few papers from Dr. Eleanor Stump of St. Louis University, who is a major Aquinas scholar and really does a beautiful job laying out both the logical arguments of the problem of evil, but then also as a very devout Catholic herself, really loves going into more of a theological standpoint in it. Anyway, I very much recommend looking further into Dr. Eleanor Stump's work, and I'm going to be borrowing a few things that she talks about. But one of the things that she puts in, and this is not necessarily her idea, but she sort of summarizes, is that actually there is at least one more claim that is needed in this case, and that is the idea that there must be no morally sufficient reason for God to allow these instances of evil. So the idea being that to add on another part of this logical argument, that there can't be an actual reason for evil to exist. That kind of completes in some way the logical loop here that we go down. And so there are many attempts. I mean, this question might be one of the oldest questions in philosophy and theology. It's just the existence of suffering, of evil, and how does that work with our idea about God. And so there are a few attempts of solving this problem. Now, one of them is to go after or reinterpret some of these initial concepts. In some cases, too, people have had discussions about what we actually think about there being, like, what does it mean for God to be all-knowing? What does it mean for God to be all-powerful and all-good? So there are some times where people will go to reinterpret these specific steps. And then, of course, we could actually fight against the premise, too, of evil existing or what that means. And we're going to go a little further into that in just a moment. So that's part of some of the defenses. One of the biggest defenses, and honestly, my personal reaction sometimes to that question, which still gets raised today. I'll still see like videos online where people will pull this exact argument up in terms of either there's not a God or God's not the way that we think God is. Usually my own personal reaction is the existence of free will. In some ways being the ultimate answer to why there would be evil in the world, and how that is still compatible with there being an all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving God. The thing is, though, that also needs to be developed a little bit further. I do ultimately believe, honestly, that free will, the fact that we have free will, does ultimately become the answer, but there are still more questions that automatically arise from this sort of a premise. So additional claims that we would add with that is that human beings have free will, and the assumption that the possession of free will itself and the use of it does more good than evil, to such a value that it justifies having free will. Meaning that, yes, evil does exist, but the good that comes from having free will, which causes evil, is a greater good. And so this does at least address that additional premise that we put in about there being a reason, that there being some sort of morally sufficient reason for evil to exist, is the idea of human beings having free will. There are some natural criticisms to this already. One is the idea of natural evil. And so we kind of break down evil into a few different categories. There would be moral evil, which would usually be the result of the actions of moral beings. And then there would be what we call natural evils. And that goes into things that we would often term like acts of God. Natural disasters, the existence of disease, of drought, all these kinds of things that we can't easily say are the immediate product of a moral being using their free will. So that's kind of a hole, at least in this style of the argument, to just say that free will is sort of the answer. But there are some other questions that come up as well. One, which I find very interesting, is the idea, is it possible, especially going through if God is all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing, is it possible for a God with those qualities to allow us to have free will, but still prevent us from committing those acts of evil? And there are many different sort of thought experiments about how that might work. The idea being that we're still capable of being able to choose that, but through whether it be divine intervention or just the way that the world works itself, that we're not capable of accomplishing it. And I think where that argument actually falls apart a little bit, it kind of makes sense, or it could make sense maybe in a single instance. Let's say somebody desires to kill somebody else, and they are able to will that and to even maybe take steps to go through it. But let's say that God actually gives that person who is the target knowledge that they are a target so that they might prevent their own destruction, or puts things in place to where that person just cannot accomplish the thing that they want. They're still able to choose that, and in essence having that free will, but not able to go through it. In a way that works in a thought experiment, or it can work in a thought experiment. The idea, if we extrapolate that over time, the idea is we don't actually have free will in that kind of environment because we're being impeded. And if we all kind of know that, yeah, maybe kind of we can choose these things, but we're never actually capable of accomplishing them, then we know that that's not actually a choice. We're not actually able to do it. So the idea being that humanity under those rules wouldn't actually end up having free will. At least that's one argument against it. There are some philosophers that say that kind of reduces human beings to kind of like toys or pets of God, that might think that they have like these choices and stuff, but they're playing with very specific parameters and never actually get to make or follow through with those decisions. The other interesting thing about at least a very straightforward explanation of like free will being the answer for why there's evil in the world is that it doesn't necessarily end up addressing more of the reasons behind the evil. We get it in terms of like it's a consequence or it's a natural response, but the idea being that there's still this lack of purpose kind of behind it. And even someone with a great deal of faith might still be kind of worn down by the idea of this kind of suffering and evil in the world. So a big part, especially with Dr. Eleanor Stump, is digging a lot deeper. There are many arguments around that end with just a very, very straightforward explanation of this. And so the idea is that we need to continue to dig deeper. Another addition to this argument, which is much closer to a Catholic defense of free will, but there's actually still a little bit of something missing, would be something that John Hicks would call soul-making. The idea that, and this is borrowing a little bit or developing the ideas of St. Irenaeus, is that the presence of evil helps us to develop traits that would make us better human beings. Now, the actual Catholic defense is very close, but there's actually a very nuanced difference in this one. The idea being the argument that is developed here is that there are virtues that only evil can develop. And so the argument or criticism against that is that it kind of makes this logical loop error where you need evil to develop virtue. Virtue gets you into heaven, where there is no evil and you don't need those virtues because the evil doesn't exist. It gets us into a bit of a logical loop when it comes to that. The idea being, too, that while evil can help us grow in virtue, and that is, again, it kind of adds purpose and good behind the nature and existence of evil in the world, that if that were our only way of getting virtues, it creates this almost like a logical feedback loop in that case. And we know as well through our experience that there are other ways of growing in virtue. Yes, adverse times, difficulty can help us grow and get stronger, but we can also practice virtue through good habits. So we know that that can't be the only explanation behind evil in that case. And so again, we go a little bit deeper. And part of that, too, this is something I really appreciate and why I specifically wanted to name Dr. Eleanor Stump. There are a lot of people that leave this as a thought experiment. But I think the fact is, most people come to this question about evil in the world, about the nature of God and our free will, because it's immensely personal. Whether we have been through tragedies ourselves, or we know someone who has, or even just, again, with what's happened on our campus, even if nobody knew Andrea, the fact that it happened so close to home is something that shakes us. And on some level, we might have been asking some of these questions. At the very least, why? This is an immensely personal thing. And so often, this argument is something that's very, it can be very superficial. But the thing is, our experience of all this is very real. And so we need to bring it a little bit deeper. So one of the arguments that Dr. Stump makes is that, especially when it comes to this idea of what we know about God, it's pulled from, well, this is what we know from all these different religions. But we kind of take it out of its context and said we need to go deeper. And so in particular, she does this, and I'll do the same. We'll go further into Catholicism. Because these aren't just sort of ideas held out abstractly. These are ideas that are held within a much, much more deep and complex framework. So to be able to try to pick apart these concepts really requires going deeper into where they come from in the first place. And that might be fair to do in all the different religions, but in this case too, to go more in the context that I would know, and I know several, if not all of you know as well, which would be going into Catholicism. So there's something else that adds, a few other claims that add a little more to free will, and these come specifically from Dr. Eleanor Stump. So adding on to all of the different, and she ends up developing a very complex, a very detailed logical argument here. I'm not writing down every single step of that, but there are three that I think bring us a lot deeper into our faith. And so under the idea of free will and going along with all this, so she adds into these very abstract claims three very concrete ones, specifically from Christianity and more specifically from Catholicism, to add in to especially this nature of the world, of human nature. Adam fell. At some point in time, Adam fell. And she even develops this as well because she really takes attention to those who may not be believers themselves, that we can also take this as at some point in time, humanity began to abuse their free will. And so for a believer, we can talk very specifically about the story of Adam from Genesis, but even if somebody does not necessarily buy into that or having trouble with that, the idea is we know human beings are capable of failure. And at some point that had a beginning. And so that's kind of where we have that argument. From that, natural evil came into the world as a consequence. And again, I'm going to go a little bit, she specifically puts in natural evil. I'll go a little further into that. And then after death, depending on the state of the human being and their soul, they will end up in either heaven or hell. Now, one of the reasons why I really wanted to follow her examples here is I think this leads us a lot deeper into three specific areas. So, going with this assumption, Adam, this leads us further into the area of human nature. Looking into free will. Like I said before, this might even bring us down the question of whether or not we have free will. Why do we have free will? As Christians, as Catholics, part of us having free will is being made in the image and likeness of God. And the beauty with that is in our own ways, we end up resembling some of these qualities. Not the all part, but the other parts, where we are capable of intellect. We have a will. We are capable of putting effort behind our intellect, and we are capable of loving. Each of these traits of God, we actually resemble ourselves in a way that no other creature really does. That's another rabbit hole I'm not going down right now. But still, and we don't even need to necessarily go down that one, but these are qualities that we have. We can think, we can reason, we can think of something and then do it. And we are capable of great love. And again, these are things that we are capable of that make us in this image and likeness of God. And the thing very specifically about this one, the ability to be good, the ability to love, to even love like God does, and to do so freely, requires the possibility that we reject it. And so, therein lies that possibility for evil. Because the only way, and again, we could follow the logical argument as well, even if we think about people who love us and how they show love to us, if they are required to do it, if they really have no other choice, it just doesn't even feel the same. We would have a natural reaction too if someone were saying that they loved us, but their actions weren't their own, that they had no choice otherwise. That's not even love. That's not even love. And so to truly be capable of love means that we have to have the ability not to as well. And therein lies the sort of potential at that point for evil. Now, does that automatically mean that human beings would choose evil? Well, not necessarily in the beginning. And this is why we specifically say, or name this in terms of Adam's fall, and kind of the nature of human beings and maybe how that changed. And so another way that we, or at least that I like making connections between some of these things, is with us having the capability to know and our will and to love, these aren't direct connections, but some of our abilities are to reason, to will, and to desire. And so Thomas Aquinas will talk about in our really right relationship, our reason is the ultimate guide to, or it should be, our reason should be the ultimate guide to our will and to our desire. That we grow in knowledge, we grow in intellect. And part of that is knowing more about how the world works, knowing how things are intended to be, God's purpose for the world, for humanity, and for everything in it. And when we know that, we can use our reason to will and even to desire. And that one might be the one that seems a little bit strange, because we today often think of our desires and our reason as maybe being separate. And this is, in a way, that's the problem. We've kind of gotten to the point where instead of this being number one, often desire can become number one, and that can lead a lot of our decisions, and maybe even be the thing that emphasizes our reason and then ultimately our will. And this is where we get into the idea of sort of a disordered humanity, disordered will, because it is not following that original intent, that original proper order for humanity. And the thing is, I had to sort of think through this myself, so if you didn't, forgive me, because I'm going to make you go through my thought process. But I do think sometimes that idea that we can actually, in a sense, create or change our desire, that might seem foreign. It's like, well, no, there are desires. There's something almost innate about them. But the thing is, we very much can over time, and I think this is when it comes to like growing in habit and growing in virtue, where we can actually make choices that will actually become easier and easier for us, where we actually do change our desire over time. I think about the fact that, to be honest, over a few years ago, I finally got into like running and doing all that kind of stuff. And beforehand, I was like, why would anybody willingly do that? You know, unless you're running away from something or someone, why would you do that? But honestly, it was kind of during COVID, and I was bored. And so I started to find more of that habit. And after a little while of doing that and trying to develop a routine, not because I enjoy this thing, but because I've just decided I'm going to do it, develop that routine, using that reason to make a choice. I'm going to do this even if I hate it, and I'm going to keep doing it. And then over time, I'm actually not going to hate it as much. And then over enough time, dang it, I actually really hate that I haven't run in the past week. You know, and then so it's a bit of a random example, but I kind of use something like that, where I think we could find that we have adapted our own desires over time, and that's kind of the purpose of using our reason to try to develop good habits. I know I've covered a lot of just different things so far. Are there any particular thoughts or questions in this moment? And I might regret that. But, all right. I know there's a lot of loose ends still right now. So we're going to go a little bit further through that still. So again, I do think that having this recognition of what our will is supposed to be, what our will kind of became, and what we even experience as well. Like, we could probably sense that bit of disorder within ourselves sometimes, that we might let ourselves kind of be led by these desires. The beautiful thing in this that I really love is that Aquinas states that we are always being motivated by doing good. We always want to be going towards the good. The problem is when we don't actually know what the true good is. And that's when we kind of come down to being led a little bit more by desires. We're still wanting to follow the good, or what we think the good is. The problem is when that becomes disordered itself. And so, again, I do think free will is still the answer to this major problem, but there are still questions for us in the midst of all of that. And one of them, is it actually worth it for human beings to have free will? I think we probably desire having free will, and at the same time, if we're looking out over everything, if the consequences are the suffering and pain and all of that, would have been better for an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving God to just not give us the choices in the first place. And so, I want to go a little bit into the nature of evil. And probably shouldn't say this out loud, but don't you love it when a statement starts like that? All day, as I've been thinking about this, like Dr. Evil pops up every single time. And so that's a dated reference. My gosh, I'm sorry. Or even just saying evil. I want to say it like that every single time. Sorry, that is a random, very random statement. But this is an interesting thing. Even just going back to the philosophical thought experiment, like, what does this even mean? What are we talking about when we are talking about evil? Now, going back to the idea that we just sort of have a response, I think we respond to a lot of different things going on in our world. We know suffering exists. We know pain exists. We know sin exists. We know that these things are going on. But what exactly are we talking about in the midst of this? Is evil anything bad? Is it just the product of moral agents? Is it all pain and suffering? Are we talking about the effects of hurricanes and natural events? And the thing is, yes. With the problem, and this is why we're talking about a very expansive area, it ends up being a bit of everything, which makes it can make it difficult to really go into. But what is evil really? And I think this is a really beautiful thing. And this really comes from, or is at least teased out a lot more by St. Augustine. Evil doesn't exist. And I think we've heard versions of this argument before, but I really do think that it's beautiful because it answers a whole nother series of questions. One of the questions, and I remember we were talking about this last night at our table at Sunday supper, one version of the multitude or multiverse of questions that we might come under is, why would God create evil? And so this is getting at least into part of that, is that evil does not exist. And that kind of, if you think about it in the same way as light and darkness, hot and cold, what evil truly is the absence of good. It really does not have any substance of itself. Good has substance, and it's when we take the good away that is evil. I think light and darkness are, we were going through kind of extensively the thermodynamics between hot and cold, so that might be a whole other thing that some of you might be more interested in talking about. But I think light and darkness, even again, if we think through it even just practically, how do we create darkness? The only way is starting to take away light. We can't create darkness. We can create light. But to create darkness is only by removing light, finding methods of removing light. And same is really true of cold. All of our methods for creating cold is really moving heat, to be able to move heat away, to take heat away. And so truly evil does not exist. So this answers one subset of questions around, well, why would God create it? It's not created. It is the absence of goodness, or more so the absence of God, which is introduced with the idea of being able to choose other than good. To choose other than God is to allow for the possibility of evil. Now, I've talked a little bit about moral evil and natural evil. And there is an interesting connection between the two, moral evil being kind of the result of our choices of moral agents, natural evil being what we might call acts of God. And there are a few interesting connections that we might make between these. One is, and this is going a lot further into especially Catholic theology and philosophy, is what kind of beings we are. We are what we call composite beings. We are made of both body and soul. We are not shells that a soul is trapped in or something like that. Once again, I've successfully brought up like an entirely different realm of philosophy and theology, so I apologize for that. But we are, in Catholicism, believe that we are composite beings. So the idea is that when there is a break in the spiritual, there is naturally an effect on the physical. And so this is why these two comments go together. In this break in the spiritual, the introduction of sin, because of this interconnection, means that physical evil would then also be introduced into the world. So that's at least one part of the argument, going really further into philosophical and theological terms. Another interesting thing, honestly, is it's hard for us to know the impact that we have on the natural world around us, especially if we take it over time. I mean, we're studying the effects now of human beings on the climate, for instance, knowing that we do in fact have impact on the world around us. Another subset of, answers around that is the idea too that do we as human beings sometimes put ourselves in harm's way? I have really good friends, and I always started off like that as if it justifies what I'm about to say. I love New Orleans. I have great friends in New Orleans. But we built a city below sea level. And so sometimes problems occur there that are kind of our fault because we decided to do something like that. So again, that was a very specific answer. And the reason why I really hesitate going in there is we can get really close into victim blaming for some of these things too. That does not justify or to be heartless about the things that happen in the world. And especially down to individuals, but do we as humanity sometimes basically put ourselves in harm's way? Maybe sometimes out of hubris, the things that we build, the places we build. Do we sometimes feel the effects of what we've decided to do as a society? So that's another kind of route. Like I said, I naturally want to be a little careful about how we go down that route. And also, too, that's an area where we don't fully know, but we can ask some of those questions that this might be part of the idea of natural evil. But one other very important thing that I brought up earlier is the idea of a purpose behind evil. I know I mentioned before that some of that could be the development of virtue. And we're getting on the right track. The problem, again, it's sort of a nuanced difference, but a problem there is the idea that it's the only route of obtaining virtue. The beauty, though, is that even if evil itself may not have a specific purpose behind it, that good can come from it. We ourselves have probably experienced through some adversities, through some difficulties, through even some very tragic events, we actually grow a great deal. We know more about ourselves and what we're capable of, and we become better human beings in the midst of it all. So yes, we can in fact grow in virtue through both moral and natural evils. It is not necessarily their full purpose, but it's a reason why, once again, they are, I suppose we could say, tolerated, allowed by God. And there's this really beautiful quote that I know I have not been quoting directly, but there's one that I wanted to give from St. Augustine about the ability for good to come from evil. For Almighty God, because he is supremely good, would never allow any evil whatsoever to exist in his works if he were not so all-powerful and so good as to cause good to emerge from evil itself. The idea being here to go back and even sort of double down on these premises. The very premises that we began with, that in some ways, for some people, might be part of the problem, actually bring us back to the solution. That God is in fact so good and so powerful that there is no evil that cannot have some good come from it. And there's a true beauty in that. The last thing that I wanted to go into, and I realize I should have realized that this was going to be a bit more expansive than even I kind of realized. So the last thing I wanted to go into with this, once again, bringing up heaven and hell, bring up a whole realm of theology here. The reason why I wanted to highlight that is this idea of a bigger picture. And I think that is very important to come to mind when we are talking about evil and suffering and our will and God's will, this idea that there is something much bigger. So part of it is this idea of eternity, that what we're experiencing right now is only part of the picture, and it's the only part that we can see right now. And I know for some, that is not a satisfying answer. And you know what? Even for people of great faith, there are some times where that too may not always feel like a satisfying answer. But there are a few important parts of it. Number one, if we are going to follow this intellectually, we have to realize that we don't actually see all the variables. That's actually a really important thing to realize, is that we do not see all of the variables that are at stake in some of these assumptions, especially if we are going to attempt to even weigh or quantify good versus evil. Is there enough good to justify the amount of evil in the world? Well, we don't even have a view of that. We don't have a view of it right now in this one specific time period, and we definitely don't have a view of it expanded both over time and into the future. And so there's this realization that this is so much bigger, and that quite frankly, we are limited. There's a certain amount of humility that comes from the idea. There's a professor I had that used the term epistemological humility, the realization that there is only so much that we can know. We are limited in our knowing, especially when it comes to this area. And sometimes there could be comfort in at least meditating over the bigger picture, even though we can't see it for ourselves, to think about the fact that we are weighing for one all of eternity, that we are one being, even if we take this one moment in time, thinking about the interactions and everything going on between all human beings, but then extrapolated over time as well, that there are these connections. Think about even in our own lives, to look over moments of pain or difficulty now versus when they happened. I know I've mentioned before, so I've been training as a Jesuit for 12 years. And at the very beginning of the process, I thought, that it's too long. I don't know about going through all of that to get to this point. And I'm just not sure I want to do all of that. And then going into it, over the course of that 12 years, there were frankly many times where I was kind of tired of that. And I wasn't always sure that that was worth it. Here and now, I look back over those 12 years, knowing that there were some painful moments. There were some major difficulties. And I could also say at this moment in time, there's not a single thing I would change about it. Because even if I look at some of those difficulties, I don't know that if I had the power to maybe remove those difficulties, I try to think through it and I'm like, I don't know what impact that would have on my state now. If I removed that difficulty, would I be the same person? Actually, I'd say no. No, because those difficulties brought me to this point. Even some where there are things that I wish had not happened, or things that I wish I had not done. Still, all of that has led me to this moment. And I think a lot of us could look back on our own lives and see some of those same moments. And the reason why I bring that up is, again, it is a personal example of something that we could use to attempt, as limited as we might be, to try to extrapolate into the future. Is there actually some story, some line, some providence that we are following that will bring us to something much greater, something that is worth the pain and the suffering and everything else that is going on at this moment in time? A place that I would like to, I know I've brought up so many things, and there's so many hanging questions and thoughts and stuff like that. But a place that I would like to conclude us with is something that's actually really beautiful from the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. So I'm a Jesuit, and so this is a big part of my spirituality. And I know I started to talk about this idea of trying to meditate on or gain some sort of grasp on this idea of our limitedness. There's a beautiful contemplation in which Ignatius actually, most of the time you are trying to meditate or imagine on things that happen in Scripture, direct stories. But every once in a while, he has something that he knows logically happened, but there are no stories or words for it. And one of those moments would be the moment of incarnation itself. And so he has you imagine that you are watching Trinity. The three persons of the Trinity watching humanity, watching all of history, all of humankind, everything that's going on, all of the good, all of the bad, people at peace, people at war, people who are fighting, people who are praying, people who are cursing. And you actually take a moment in this prayer to attempt, as limited as we might be, to imagine God looking over all of that. And then you imagine that as God sees all of this, which includes plenty of evil and pain and suffering, what is God's response to seeing all of that? It's the incarnation itself. The Trinity, seeing our pain and our suffering, decides the second person of the Trinity will go into the world to lead us out of that pain and suffering. That one of the multitude of questions we might ask is, where is God in the midst of all of it? God, viewing everything that's going on, decided to join us, to become one of us, to also experience pain and suffering, and quite frankly, evil itself, so that all of that might be crucified and die with him on the cross. And I know that maybe if we're coming at this argument intellectually, that might be a place where it might be difficult for us to imagine to place ourselves there, but the idea is that the entire crux of our faith is actually an answer to this question. That even though for some, and maybe sometimes for us, this idea, this logical argument might be difficult, that God actually is the answer to the problem itself. And so, whole nother question, all sorts of questions. Why then is there still pain and suffering and evil? Well, it brings us back to what really ends up being the center of all of this, and that is free will. We still have a choice. God has shown us his choice, and it is to be with us, even in the midst of the suffering, even in the midst of everything. And so now, we continue to work, both individually and as a community, to make our choice too. Trying to grow in our own knowledge, in our will, in our goodness, that we might make the same kind of response that God has to us, so that we can actually be part of the solution to the questions that we ask. That is part of the power and the beauty of what God has given us, the ability to love as he does, that we actually have the opportunity, the gift, the power to do something about all of this that we're seeing in the world. And so I encourage you to continue to figure out how we might make those choices ourselves, to continue to grow, that we might be the solution that we're looking for by combining our will, joining our will with the will of God. I know there's so much more to go through, but that is where I thought we would at least conclude this part of that discussion. We're about 7:30 right now. I know I've left us with so many different things, but what I thought might be helpful, since I've been talking for so long, and I enjoy it, is to maybe separate into just a couple of different groups of like 3 or 4, and to have a chance to process. What are things from this discussion that resonate, that might make sense, that still don't make sense, that you still want to go down? What are new questions that you have from this that still need to be answered? Because the beauty in that, even when we still have questions, is God has given us the ability to follow them. And so again, there is great beauty in that even if we leave tonight with more questions, that's not the end of the story either. So thank you so much for coming, and I encourage you now to get in those groups, and I'll be happy to kind of jump around to